Hey everyone, before we kick off today's episode, just a few things I wanted to touch on. First of all, the live stream last week that we were supposed to have on Jason Hebert's channel didn't come together. I know a lot of you were concerned because I was talking about on the live stream that I wound up doing that I had spoken to him and he was really sick. And that is effectively what took him out of doing the live stream. But he's on the mend. I hope that he's going to get back to work soon. I do think it's important that we help the Echo Lloyd case. So I'm going to roll forward with my coverage of it. And then if he is still going to interview Echo's daughter, we'll find another time to do that over on his channel. But just to let everyone know that was so concerned, Jason is doing okay. He's on the path to healing, let's just say. On top of that, a big thank you to everyone that kicked over to my channel and we recorded a new episode of Seriously Mysterious. So I really appreciate you guys joining me for that. Speaking of podcasts, Crime After Crime, this month's episode, Yuletide Crimes, the story that I tell, I am extremely proud of just for hitting the right tone. It's a tough story. I know some of you might think about Crime After Crime and think, oh, that's where they do those goofy topics and kind of, add jokes to this stuff. This episode is very, very different for both of our stories, Danielle's and mine. And I really hope that several of you might think about checking that out. I'll have a link to the podcast version in the description box down below. With all that being said, let's get to BrainScratch.
I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't inhale it. But it is hard. I know that people are scared and people don't like to tell and don't like to snitch, but you have to think about, what if this was your brother? You didn't just kill one person. When you take that person, you take their whole family. You take something away from everybody who loved them.
That was Vivian Powers, the sister of victim Brian Powers, and this is one of the toughest types of case that we cover here on the channel. It's a shooting. We're not exactly certain if he was shot at the location where he was found. It doesn't sound like we have a lot for physical evidence. This is a case that really needs help. It needs exposure raised. It needs the social circles to be talking. And hopefully the person out there that might have overheard the right conversation will step up and do the right thing, pick up the phone, and use that information that I have in the description box down below. But this case also points towards a disturbing trend that we're going to touch on by the end of this episode as well. Let's go ahead and jump into the details and learn more about what's going on here. Over at beaconjournal.com, man 43 found shot dead at edge of University of Akron campus. Brian Powers, 43 of Akron, was discovered by a passerby shortly before 8 a.m. Saturday, and that is Saturday, June 13th, on a grassy area on the southwest corner of Chapel Drive and East Bucktel Avenue. Akron police and EMS who responded found Powers with multiple gunshot wounds. He was pronounced dead at the scene. It is not clear whether he was killed at the site or his body was dropped there. The university alerted students to the homicide Saturday in its daily digest. Powers is not believed to have been a UA student at the time of his death, the school said in its digest item. Let's learn a little bit about where this is going on. University of Akron is a public research university in Akron, Ohio. It's part of the University System of Ohio. It has an enrollment of approximately 18,000 students. That is across several different campuses in the area. But if we take a look at the satellite map here, actually, let's kick to the regular map so you can get a sense of the area a little bit easier before we look at the satellite. The chapel is right here. Chapel Drive is here and Bucktel Avenue here. So this is the intersection. But you can see University of Akron, the center of it is just directly to the west. And if we do kick back to the actual satellite imagery, you can see this is a large university center, lots of different buildings all around here, lots of parking structures also, particularly around the area where this took place, which I was hopeful might actually help with cameras or footage that might be found. But it doesn't sound like that has been a very strong lead in this. But like, look, we've got a parking lot pretty much directly where he is found. Based on their description, this cluster of trees here, this is the area where he was found. The other thing I'm a little bit concerned about in terms of their theory of this being a drop-off is we've got a highway right here. And it does look like there are exit ramps and entrance ramps that get pretty close to that area. So I'm just wondering if he could have been shot somewhere else. People loaded him up in a car, drove, hit one of the exit ramps, literally pulled over, kicked him out of the car, and then continued, jumped back onto the highway, and were gone within a matter of moments. And that might help describe why they haven't been able to find any camera footage that's helpful. Pretty much if we look to the west, if we look to the north, if we look to the south of this area, I'm seeing a lot of opportunities for cameras. If we look east, it's a little bit different because we're getting into what looks like a neighborhood. There are some businesses that are sort of sprinkled in the neighborhood, but not really on Buckdale. You can see Buckdale has a lot of homes that are facing it for at least 4 or 5 blocks before it gets to a few services. There's a CVS and a Circle K, and then closer to this intersection, there's more businesses. But effectively, for cameras, looks like you've got a pretty decent blackout zone directly here. So I'm not sure if they continued on the freeway or if they just headed east, maybe turned off on one of these side streets before they got to this main area where cameras would most likely pick them up again. Just to take a look at the actual intersection where this happened, here's that grassy area that I pointed out. And admittedly, the parking structure pretty well hidden behind the trees back there. So even if it does have cameras, I don't know what their view would be like of getting this area. If we look across the street for any potential witnesses or cameras, we don't have a whole lot because the chapel that is over here is actually set back quite a bit. There's another parking area before you actually get to that building, just an open road. You know, there's no buildings right up here on this intersection. So it's just, unfortunately, there's not a lot of camera coverage from what I can see here. And based on the information that we're seeing from the sources, it seems like that's a challenge they're having too. Let's learn a lot more about Brian. Unfortunately, it breaks my heart. I mean, his sister is working so hard trying to raise exposure to this case. She's doing all the interviews she can. Thankfully, there are a couple of very good journalists that get a hold of this story, and I'm going to be pointing them out as we go forward too. But there's something that really tugs at my heart about Brian because you have someone that has wanted to express himself in a different way for his life and has faced a lot of adversity because of that. And that's part of the trend that I mentioned earlier in this video that is disturbing that we're seeing in 2020 in particular. But the other thing that breaks my heart is learning about people through their obituaries. Brian Joseph Powers was born in Akron on April 11th, 1977. He is the son of Walter Powers and Veronica Frymouth, and the loving brother of another Walter Powers and Vivian Powers Smith. Of course, that's his sister who we saw at the start. Brian attended McElbright Elementary, Roswell Kent Middle School, and Garfield High School. He was a proud advocate for the LGBTQ community, of which he was known as Egypt. He enjoyed cooking, old movies, and meeting new people. Brian was truly unforgettable with an infectious laugh and always smiling. He will be deeply missed by his family and many friends who all knew and loved him. Over at a website called hrc.org, that is the Human Rights Campaign. We're going to get some more information from them, but I just wanted to let you know what this website was because I wasn't familiar with it initially. Leading the fight for LGBTQ rights. We've spent 40 years creating the most powerful movement for equality our country has ever seen, but despite this progress, our most marginalized are still suffering from violence, discrimination, and fear. Our goal is to ensure that all LGBTQ people, and particularly those of us who are trans, people of color, and HIV positive, are treated as full and equal citizens within our movement, across our country, and around the world. So they posted an article, and you can really feel the pain from their perspective of just, here we go again. And by the way, we're having more and more murders of this nature. And what's it going to take to stop this? HRC mourns Brian Egypt Powers, black trans person killed in Ohio. Powers' death is believed to be, at the time of this writing, at least the 17th violent death of a transgender or gender nonconforming person this year in the U.S. We say at least because too often these stories go unreported or misreported, which led me down a little bit of a rabbit hole. I'm not going to include too much of it in today's video, but there's other concerns when, when a body is taken in and they go to the official ID and they see that it's listed as a man or it's listed as a woman. That can be confusing to the investigations as well. So there's a lot of different levels to this conversation, still a lot of things that have to be addressed. Based on the stats that I'm seeing, you can get your state issued IDs updated, but effectively it's such a laboring process. It's such an expensive process. A lot of people don't do it. It looks like somewhere around 11% of people will actually have their ID altered. So with these investigations, it adds another technicality that could be difficult to the investigation. As a child, Powers dreamed of becoming a backup dancer for Janet Jackson or Paula Abdul. Powers worked at a local catering company and is remembered for wearing long, colorful braids, unicorn braids, as Powers called them. According to reports, Brian identified as transgender but continued to use he, him pronouns and his birth name. He also sometimes used the name Egypt. And from what I understand, Egypt is almost like an alternate persona for Brian. There are currently very few explicit federal legal protections for transgender or gender-expansive people. We're also going to hear there's some particular challenges in Ohio. Nationally, despite some marginal gains in state and local policies that support and affirm transgender people, recent years have been marked by anti-LGBTQ attacks at all levels of government. Moving on to another publication, thedevilstrip.com. Who was Brian Powers? Family and friends describe him as a ball of light. And I want to point out, this is one of the writers I really want to point out, Noor Hindi, just did an excellent job pulling this piece together and really focusing on that core question. Who is Brian? Noor reached out to family and friends specifically collecting that type of information. Of course, it's got the basics of the case, but in terms of raising exposure for a case of this nature, that's so difficult because we don't have the physical evidence to chew over. We don't have all the small details to talk about. Well, what about this that was found or that was found? Or can we do this type of testing or that type of testing? So as a creator in this space, I'm constantly thinking about how can you compel people to share this story? How can you get more hearts and minds open to this? And this is a great example to focus on Brian's life, to really share his personality, his struggles, and memories of him through his family and friends. When loved ones think of Brian Powers, what comes to mind is his laugh. Loud, infectious, deep. From what I understand, he was 6'4", so I'm pretty sure that was a loud laugh. When you heard Brian's laugh, you knew he was in the room, probably rocking his unicorn hair with 4 or 5 colors on his head. He loved colors. The brighter, the better. Yellow was his favorite. With his lipstick and sunglasses, his 6'3" stature, and his hearty laugh, you couldn't not notice Brian. He also had a thing for sunglasses based on the pictures that I'm seeing, like more expressive sunglasses, almost like Elton John variety. Brian often compared himself and his sister to Dora and Boots from Dora the Explorer. As kids, they were inseparable, with Brian insisting he sit next to her at all family functions. They were 3 years apart, and Brian loved his big sister. As adults, when he couldn't reach Vivian, he'd joke about pulling out the map from Dora and finding her. When he was little, he didn't talk to other people for about 4 years. He would whisper things to me. But once he started talking, he never stopped, Vivian said. When the two got older, their relationship grew stronger and stronger. Brian would often pop up at Vivian's house during the day, asking to go on a walk or go to the park or sit by the lake. He was easy to talk to and easily distracted, often diverging into funny tangents. He loved animals, Vivian says, especially his beta fish named Miguel, and later, a neighborhood cat that Brian adopted. As kids growing up in South Akron, Vivian always knew Brian was gay. He'd often dress in ways people perceived as feminine, and his walk, which he'd later perfect, was fierce and sassy. To Vivian, Brian was just Brian, even as he threw on a skirt, or his Daisy Duke shorts, or became Egypt, his alter ego. Though Vivian often worried about his safety, Brian was fearless. He owned his identity and didn't take disrespect from anybody. His sister continues, "He did a show at the Interbelt nightclub as a drag queen, and I was so proud of him. He was gorgeous and so confident and just so sassy. His makeup was flawless. And when he became Egypt, he was a little diva, just gorgeous, and his spirit matched it." His best friend since childhood, Carlton Amos, says Brian was always protective even as a kid. When they were younger, Carlton and Brian would joke about becoming like Laverne and Shirley, getting an apartment together, having cute bad boy boyfriends, and working together. "We were gay, and we were young, and kids pick on you when you're not like them. And Brian struggled a lot with that," Carlton said. "I'll tell you this, he wasn't going to let nobody disrespect him. He had hands," he says, laughing. Anytime someone messed with Carlton, Brian would fight them. He usually won. But Carlton says Brian wasn't the type of person to go looking for trouble. And here we have a picture of Carlton. "He knew no strangers, and in that way, he had an infectious spirit that rubbed off on me. I was very shy," Carlton says. When remembering Brian, friends and family picture the Brian who always laughed, who danced, who knew the lyrics to every Beyoncé song, and who was a friend to everyone that met him. "If you hear him laugh, you're going to laugh," Vivian says, and he always wanted to make people happy. Doesn't this sound like someone that we all need in our lives? It's just really tugging at my heart looking into this case. And something else I wanted to talk about is Brian also had struggles. There was periods of time where he had trouble finding places to live. There was periods of time where he was struggling with drug abuse, but he was always working towards better things. He had really gotten his life on a very good track several months before this occurrence. And it's one of those things where I want to mention it because in terms of understanding this case better, are there elements of that might be related to this? I don't know. Possibly. That's really the reason why I want to be sure to include that information. But I think it's also important that we learn about Brian, learn about his personality, and maybe that will help the social information. Could be people that just heard that nightclub or people that frequent that nightclub go, "Oh, hold on a second. I heard a little something, but there was no name attached to it. Maybe this is related to that. I need to call this in." So that's why, from my perspective, for a case like this, when you don't have all the physical evidence pieces that I like to review, the social information can be just as important, but people have to know about it. And that's why we're doing this here today. Over at beaconjournal.com, another shout out to a very good writer, Seema Bayram. And I've got to say, I found out at the bottom of this article, there was a special program that actually put Seema into the Akron Beacon Journal. It's a organization called Report for America, a national service that places journalists into local newsrooms. I thought that was really, really cool. And when I see journalism like this, I knew there was something different about it because it is just so personalized, so well researched. There's such a good thing. If you read only one article on this case, make it this one. Of course, I'm going to have it in the sources down below. Who killed Brian Powers? Police have no leads. Loved ones want answers. When Brian Joseph Powers called his friend Carlton Amos, same friend that we were just quoting, on Saturday, a Saturday morning in early June, the men did what they had done since they were kids in South Akron. They shared their dreams. Brian told Amos of his aspirations to start his own t-shirt company, but on that June 6th morning, he was happy to be at home in his own apartment. After struggling with substance abuse and housing insecurity for much of his adult life, Powers had been sober for 7 months. Finally, he was closer to his dream of stability. He had also turned his other passion, cooking, into a career, as he was working alongside his friend Herdestein Price for her catering company. But Powers' dreams were abruptly cut short. A week after that phone call to Amos, a groundskeeper found Powers lying face up and motionless on the sidewalk outside of a church near downtown Akron. Authorities later declared that Powers, a transgender man who's also known as Egypt, was a homicide victim. Now remember, the initial report said there was multiple gunshots. We're going to find out things are a little bit different here. He died from wounds caused by a single bullet, but the bullet pierced both thighs. He was 43. So you're probably thinking, gunshot to the thigh, that sounds like it's survivable. There's a very good chance it is, but here at teachmeanatomy.info, we get a very simple diagram, and you can see there is a substantial artery, the femoral artery, that runs through this. And essentially having that bullet pass through one thigh is already a certain amount of risk. But then having it pass through a second thigh as well, you've now doubled that risk. The chances of hitting the femoral artery just doubled, and it seems like that's what happened in this case. More than a month later, family and friends continue to search for clues. Police have not turned up any information on a suspect or a witness. Investigators did not recover bullets or casings at the site, only Powers' cell phone, and the medical examiner does not know the time of death. I'm very curious about that. I don't know how we don't understand the time of death. And I'm hearing kind of different descriptions on how he was found. Some of them are saying, well, all of them are saying that he was declared dead at the scene. But some of them allude to the fact that when first responders arrived, I'm not positive that he had passed away yet. Even if he had, there's kind of a simple tool that they could use if they got his body temperature at that time. And it's a little bit vague, but it would get you into a range of hours of when he had likely passed away. Very interesting to me here that we don't have the time of death narrowed down. And that's kind of critical, particularly when we're talking about looking for cameras, trying to cross-reference this information, looking for witnesses that might have been in the area. If we don't have a specific time frame to say, hey, we need to figure out who was in this area at 3 a.m., it gets a lot tougher. Because if you do have that information, you could go to the school and say, okay, hey, we need to know, we need your time clocks for employees, everyone that was working at this particular time. Now, I think they could still take an approach like that, but they're going to have to do it with a range of time. Having it ratcheted down to a specific time frame of like an hour or two would probably make that searching a lot easier, particularly on the video front, but we don't have that here. In terms of time frame, we do get something. Powers' last phone call was shortly after 3 a.m., about 5 hours before his body was found. Is that showing some, we have a range that's going on there. Of course, we have to assume that it was him that used the phone at 3 a.m., but that's what kind of strikes me. If he's found at 8 a.m., he's only been out there for 5 hours. I'm still just wondering how they don't have the time frame really ratcheted down for the time that he actually passed. For Vivian Powers Smith, the silence around her brother's death is confounding. I would think someone would know something. Nobody's saying anything. I agree with her. I'm trying to think of situations that could be going on here. And like I said at the start, we don't know if he was dropped at this location after being shot. One of the things that is going through my head is if this is a true hate crime, was he shot literally by someone just driving by? Someone that noticed a 6'3" man with multicolored hair walking down a university avenue. Was that enough to invite this level of violence in some way? That, in my mind, is the worst case scenario for a case like this, because then the connectivity between the victim and the perpetrator is so loose. How do you backtrace that? How do you figure that out? But to Vivian's point, even in that instance, someone should be talking. And the other thing is the gunshot wound, the location of the wound to me. Thinking about a gunshot wound piercing both thighs in particular, that doesn't seem like it's a very well delivered wound. It doesn't seem like the intent might have been to end his life. It might have been, but if it was, then it was under some conditions where they couldn't get a great shot. We're not talking a shot to the chest. We're not talking something more traumatic. There's a chance that he could have survived being shot in that manner. And we're not seeing any signs of anyone making sure that that wasn't going to be the case. So that's got me concerned and kind of puts me more in the mindset that this could be something where it's someone just completely unrelated, just like a pure, I hate to keep phrasing it this way, but a pure hate crime, just someone that was upset at the appearance that they saw and lashed out at it. And then perhaps, they find out in the news the next day that Brian has passed away, and now they really have to button things down, and maybe they're even less likely to be talking about it publicly. But even in those cases, especially if it's someone that didn't intend to kill Brian, I would like to think that their humanity is at them. And maybe with that, it's going to drive them to talk to somebody. And maybe that's the person that actually picks up the phone. I don't know. This case is tough on some level. I'm almost hoping that there is more connectivity there, that it is something related to a prior incident or a previous, like maybe something related to his previous lifestyle in terms of drug use and things like that. Just something where investigators have a chance to actually backtrace this. That's one of the toughest things about this case. Investigators determined that Powers walked about 100 yards after he was shot before collapsing near the church, Vivian said. So I'm very curious about that because I don't know what direction. I've actually tried reaching out to Vivian. Unfortunately, I haven't heard back from her in time for this recording. But if we do look at the area and we're talking 100 yards, I don't know if it's coming from the college direction. I don't know if it's coming from the freeway direction. It might even be coming from a different street. I don't think it would be Chapel Drive. It might be coming from Goodkirk. And we also don't have the exact details on how they're making that assessment. I would think they might be following drips of blood back to their original source. But something else that I've seen pop up in a few articles here, and I don't know if it's changed over the course of this investigation. There was no shell casings found, at least where he was. Now that they've backtraced it to, him being 100 yards away, I don't know if that changed and if they found shell casings at that original location. If they did, I'd be very curious to know, was that shell casing in the middle of the street? Was it at the side of the road? What are the conditions around that? That someone could leave her brother to die on the street hurts Vivian. I don't know how it doesn't hurt all of us, just hearing about occurrences like this. The family wants to see more urgency in the investigation into his death. So also, just to be clear, I'm seeing information that, look, the family is really not sure if the police are working this case as hard as they could be. Is there some more bias that's coming in? Is it racially driven? Is it driven by his sexual identity or his sexual orientation? I think it's tough to look at a case like this and to not think that. But on the flip side of that, I'm also looking at this with a little bit of an investigative mindset and saying, what do you do here? Like, how do we figure this out? Particularly if there is no shell casing. Now, one piece of information that they haven't put out, which I don't know if it would be hugely helpful, but understanding what type of weapon was used might be a little bit helpful if that went out public. Just because if there's someone that is connected to this person, maybe they know them to have a specific weapon, or they saw a specific weapon in a strange place, things of that nature. That might elicit some tip that could potentially help this case, but make no mistakes about it. This is a tough case based on the information that I'm seeing and that we're even hearing through the family. There's not a lot to try to follow this thread down and get to the answer of what's going on here. And that's why I'm saying I really hope that there is some connectivity that they can eventually find. The family made a GoFundMe page to raise reward money, hoping that it might entice someone with information to come forward. Quote, "Money talks," a police officer told Vivian. Given the high rates of violence against LGBTQ plus people in America and Powers' own experience with transphobic attacks, his loved ones fear he may have been the victim of a hate crime. which I'm still going to say would be the absolute worst case in terms of this investigation, and it finding an eventual conclusion. I just want to keep him relevant. I don't want people to forget about him. Not just the fact that he was murdered. I want them to know he was a good person. He was a brother and a son and an uncle and a friend, Vivian said. He mattered. His life mattered to the people who loved him. Over at news5cleveland.com, we get an update 2 months later. Still no answers for family of transgender man murdered in Akron. For me, I don't know if it was something random or if someone just saw him dressed as Egypt and decided to shoot, Power Smith said. She's raising an interesting point about the random act, and it's making me also wonder about that freeway overpass, because knowing that he might have walked 100 yards, so we're talking about 300 feet from where he was found, between where he was found and where he was shot. Yeah, no, it's farther than the freeway overpass. I was just thinking what if there was possibly someone that was driving up or down the freeway and decided to fire a shot off at someone that they saw walking over it. But the distance doesn't look right. It looks like if he was east, he was likely around between Franklin and Adolph Street. If he was west, closer towards the center of the college, I would say he was somewhere around the intersection of Buchtel and Spicer Street. Of course, we don't know. He could have also been on Good Kirk. At least 27 transgender people were murdered in the U.S. last year, according to the Human Rights Campaign. It's like people treat them like they're just expendable, said Vivian. With no leads in the investigation, Power Smith has no idea if her brother was the victim of a hate crime. Even if Akron police receive substantial tips or make an arrest, Powers' murder could be difficult to prosecute as a hate crime under current state law. Ohio is one of 14 states where hate crimes do not include gender identity or sexual orientation. I'm shocked. Like, I can't believe that we don't have laws in place in all 50 states at this point to handle that. Now, from what I understand, there are some local statutes that do provide protection in Akron in particular. So, but still, to not have that at the state level, I don't know. And that's not saying that, if they find the person, they can charge them with manslaughter or murder, some degree of that. But in terms of also charging them with additional hate crime charges, at least for a state level, it looks like it might not be possible in this area. My little brother is gone. Somebody stole him. They didn't have the right to do that, Power Smith said. No matter if he was gay, straight, transgender, heterosexual, you don't have the right to take somebody's life. The hardest thing I ever had to do was pray for the person who murdered my brother. I'm not at the part where I forgive you. I don't know if I'll ever get there, she said, but I have to pray that somehow God touches your heart and you do the right thing. It's never too late to do the right thing. And over at CNN, we see an article from November 20th, 2020. A record number of transgender and gender nonconforming people in the U.S. have been killed in 2020. And it's almost scarier to me to hear something like that when we're thinking about what this year has been like, with lockdowns and people not going out into the public. I mean, it's just, I don't know. I would think that would actually lower this number, but it seems to have gone the other direction. More transgender and gender nonconforming people have been killed in the U.S. in 2020 than any year since the Human Rights Campaign first began tracking these numbers back in 2013. As of Friday, at least 37 trans and gender nonconforming people have been killed this year in what the HRC called an epidemic of violence. The HRC wrote in its annual report, "Each one of the lives we lost was somebody ripped from their family, their friends, and their community by an act of senseless violence, often driven by bigotry and transphobia and inflamed by the rhetoric of those who oppose our progress." Over the past 7 years, there have been 202 reported cases of fatal violence against transgender and gender nonconforming victims, and Black transgender women make up 66% of these deaths, according to HRC's report. HRC's report comes just 3 days after the FBI released its hate crime report for 2019. There were 7,103 hate crimes reported to the FBI in 2019, and of these, a combined 19.6% were based on sexual orientation or gender identity. We look into a lot of different tragic events on this channel. All of them kind of grab at me in a different way. But this one, really, it just leaves me with one phrase that is floating through my mind, and it's, we should be doing better. We should be better than this. We should be at the point where we're not looking at people because of their differences and hating them to the point of taking actions like this. I mean, it's, I think it's something that needs to be addressed on so many different fronts. It needs to be conversations that we're having with our friends, conversations within our families, showing the next generation. Well, actually, it's weird because for me, sometimes I feel like it's not showing the next generation. It's showing the previous generations that there's a different way of being that is better for this planet. But and I still don't know. I don't know that Brian's case is necessarily a hate crime, but the information that is coming up with this case around those types of events just really has me thinking. And I wish there was a simple answer, and there just isn't. I wish there was a donation that I could make that would make all this go away, and I just haven't figured out how to do that yet. But I also did make a conscious decision that when I saw this case, I knew I had to cover it. I realize it might not be my most popular video ever, but I'm hoping that it's at least starting some good conversations, opening up some parts of people's minds and hearts out there, maybe making them think a little bit different about cases like this. And that's why I wanted to spend so much time getting to know Brian. And I got to tell you, I feel like the world is missing out without that bright ball of energy, that splash of color here for us. There is a GoFundMe, as we mentioned in the articles, looking to raise a $5,000 reward. They're currently at $3,201. On behalf of myself and my very, very good supporters on Patreon, PayPal, we're going to make a donation to this just as soon as I'm done with today's episode. And HRC, I just learned about you today, and I think what you're aiming for, what you're doing, is extremely important. And today's story just gave me a little glimpse of the challenges that you're facing with that. I think I saw a donate button here too. So you know what, on behalf of my amazing supporters and in honor of Brian Powers, who I will also note while I'm doing this, I'm going to make a donation to the HRC also. I'll have links in the description box below, so if you guys feel compelled to do the same, please join me in supporting HRC and the GoFundMe for Brian, and let's hope that justice can come for this family. I know it's going to be tough. I know it's going to be difficult, but we have seen some amazing things happen with the cases that we cover here on the channel. I'm hoping that this is one of those cases. I'm hoping that someone out there that has the right heart and the right information does the right thing and really helps this family. A big thank you to a few PayPal supporters. Thank you, Mark Witt, and thank you, Wendy Russell. Appreciate you guys. If you'd like to support the channel, please visit lordandarts.com, where you can sign up for Patreon, sign up for PayPal, or buy merchandise. All of it keeps me here looking into some very, very tough situations with you guys, coming to a new understanding. I got to tell you, after today's episode, my understanding of these issues is different. I'm going to be thinking for a while about what else can I do to help the LGBTQ plus community. And I hope that you guys will be too. Have a good weekend. Take care of each other. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you back here on Monday with a brand new episode of Case Cracked on the Lord and Arts channel.